I want to come right back to the present with China. Before we move on from China, we go to submarines. I want to really address China because um, a lot of people are concerned that we're headed for war. We're headed. I mean, this is kind of a new Cold War. This is kind of the rhetoric is going on, the posturing is going on, the military buildup is going on. The NATO equivalent in the Quad is now forming. There's a lot of parallels, in my opinion, to the Cold War. Is that where we're at, or is this markedly different? Is it wrong? Is it a mistake for us to look at the Cold War for lessons to apply to now?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a mistake, but whenever you use historical analogies, you have to realize that they are simply a form of thought experiment to try and frame an issue. They're not a description of the current situation. You see rough similarities. You say, well, so to what extent are we in a situation like that, rather than, oh, it's exactly like that, and therefore you've got a straightforward path.
Yeah.
This is in some ways comparable in that we're dealing with a totalitarian power that is becoming increasingly aggressive, and we've got to think of ways of containing that aggression and working towards amelioration of the political situation inside that state, short of war, because we no more want a general war with China than we ever want to run the Soviet Union. And bear in mind that there are still big strategic nuclear arsenals, and it ought to be the case that they will constrain large-scale war for the same reasons that they did during the Cold War. That is that people in Beijing understand perfectly well, as they do in Washington and as they did in Moscow. You really don't want to use these things. You want to use them only as a deterrent to the other side using them. Yeah. And the arcane logic of deterrence is scary, but it worked, right, in a Cold War.
It's hard to conclude anything other than it works, given the result of the Cold War with Russia. I mean, an inordinate amount of money was spent on all of these development of arsenals. And I mean, of course, was it Dr. Strangelove, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, was a beautiful parody on that whole, the mine shaft gap and the whole arms race that happened during that era. And yet it's hard to argue with the result that we ended up defeating I was barely born. I was 7 years old when the Berlin Wall fell. I was actually in Europe when the Berlin Wall fell, funnily enough. Not that I understood what was going on at the time. I didn't understand why people were crying about the fact that a wall had fallen down. I was very, very confused. But that ended without a widespread conflict. And obviously that's what any sane person is hoping for in terms of what happens with China. Do you think that's a realistic outcome to hope for?
Yeah, I think it is. And if only because the Soviet Union had twice been invaded by Germany in the first half of the 20th century, and that had shaped its grand strategy and led to a widespread idea, cultivated, of course, by the Communist Party, that the outside world was hostile towards it. By comparison, what's happened with China over the last 30, 40 years is that it's prospered enormously, just to the extent that it was open to the outside world to trade with it, to accept foreign investment, to acquire, even if it had to steal it, advanced technologies, and that went so well that it was widely expected, as we said before, that China would embrace that and say, well, this is good. Why would we want to go back? And instead, we've seen this disconcerting development where Xi Jinping has said, that being closed off, being almost autarkic, is the China dream. We're going to trade with the world, but completely on our own terms and pursuing only our own interests.
Yeah.
Pardon me. I think the advantages of doing it differently to the way he's doing it are evident. And they're evident to a lot of people in China, including inside the Communist Party. And that's that's our trump card. Perhaps I shouldn't say trump card.
That term has been burned.
But that's where we need to place our bet. But in order to constrain Xi Jinping in the meantime, we're forming strategic alliances just in order to send the signal, listen, if you don't tether your horses a bit. This is going to run away from all of us.
Yeah.
All right. So we've got to send the message simultaneously. If you resort to force, you run the risk of defeat and of grave damage, even of a general war. You really shouldn't want those things. If what you want is trade and trust, then start working that way, because that's what we're after.
To a certain degree, though, that relies on the sanity of the other party. You know, that strategy wouldn't necessarily work with someone like the Iranian mullahs, who have a religious element to their particular worldviews. Is Xi Jinping going to respond the way that we expect to this kind of pressure?
I'm not sure that he will, but I think that to the extent that he doesn't, people around him who have deep pockets and strong interests will say, well, then he's not the appropriate man to lead us, because we want that other future, right?
Okay.
And when I wrote this piece in the Eyes a couple of weeks ago about the removal of Xi, one of the parallels I used to illustrate the kind of thing I'm referring to was in 1964, the old Stalinists in the Politburo removed Nikita Khrushchev as the boss man of the Soviet Union. Why did they do it? Well, at the time, people said, oh, because he was the revisionist and he was opening the system up and they wanted to go back to Stalinism. That's only part of the story. The main reason they removed him is because they were essentially cautious and conservative, and they thought he was reckless. They thought that his attempt to put nuclear missiles in Cuba had almost led to World War III, and they really didn't need that. That his Virgin Lands program in Central Asia had been an economic and ecological disaster, you know, and he hadn't thought it through. And so they wanted more stable and sensible leadership. Now, they ended up with Leonid Brezhnev, under whom the Soviet Union essentially stagnated. And that was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. But the reason they removed Khrushchev was because he was erratic and impulsive. And I think a good case could be made that Xi Jinping is showing some of those same characteristics. All right. So, and this is the argument of Garside that I referred to. And where he and I differ is chiefly in that he made this bold prediction that the removal will occur in the next 12 months. I'm not sure it will occur, but I think that we should be looking very closely at how we could encourage such an outcome. And that will, of course, spook Xi Jinping, but it will send the message to others around him. We'll work with you, but we won't really work with this guy because we don't think we can. We think he needs to go.
Does that lead to a purge, though? I mean, if you tried the same strategy with North Korea, for example, then you're just going to get a whole bunch of executions happening in the next couple of weeks and months of all the people named in someone's article, of all the people that he has any level of concern about. Am I being unfair? Is that realistically the lengths that Xi Jinping would go to hold on to power?
Oh, he's already doing it. He's had a lot of people knocked off and arrested and disappeared. Make no mistake. I mean, Roger went so far as to suggest that Li Keqiang, the premier, would lead the coup. And that's Li, must himself be sitting in Beijing thinking, Roger, I really wish you hadn't written that.
Yeah, please don't do that again. I'd like to be able to sleep at night. Yeah.
And not be disappeared one fine day.
Oh, goodness. Look.